Have you ever wondered why sometimes it seems like we collectively end up with outcomes that none of us individually tried to achieve? And I'm going to give you like one concrete example. So, you know, how many of us said, yeah, I really want more pollution? Probably very few people, right? And yet somehow as a collective, as societies, as a species, we're creating a world that's very polluted. So, to me, that's a bit of a puzzle. How our individual aspirations somehow get violated as a result of our own activity. So that's kind of a puzzle. And there's often the temptation to find a villain to blame for this. Elon Musk, or the oil producing countries that are greedy or stuff like that. But in many problems like this, you could try to find a villain and you remove the villain and the problem doesn't go away. So it's deeper than just like a single villain. It's something that somehow is an emergent result of what we're all doing. When you have a complex system, and by complex system, I just mean something that has a lot of interacting parts, right? So it could be, a city made of people and, equipment. It could be a brain made of neurons. It could be a group, made of people interacting, or, a soccer team. Whenever you have a complex system and the collective behavior is surprising, like the resultant behavior is not necessarily what you would predict, then that's what's called emergence. So emergence is just essentially another way of saying surprised by, it's not intuitive. And when that behavior is unwelcome, we could call it an emergent dysfunction. And that's, I think, actually my personal phrase. Emergence is a common phrase in complex system science. And so what I'm going to talk about today is different kinds of emergence. And then based on that, talk about different kinds of emergent dysfunctions and what we can do about them. So as I said, complex systems consist of many simple parts interacting over time, and includes basically almost everything interesting. Their behavior in aggregate is often non-intuitive. So for example, if you look at an individual bird, you could watch an individual bird, and study them deeply, right? But would you have predicted, based on watching an individual bird, that they're going to do something like this in aggregate? I mean, if you never, you've seen it, so you know what happens. But if you hadn't actually seen it, would you have necessarily predicted it? So that's one example of emergence. Another is, if you look at a brain, it's a squishy mass of a whole bunch of squishy cells that have like strings coming out, and the strings are attached. Would you be able to predict that, an Einstein or whatever, or a faith, or, would come out of that, right? That's another kind of emergence. It's very difficult to know, based on looking at the pieces and their interactions, what the whole thing is going to do. And the heart of this is the feedback, is the loops of feedback. If you had like a bunch of rocks sitting on a beach and they didn't interact with each other at all, there would be no emergence. They would just sit there forever. But if you have some things which are able to interact with each other, that, if one piece does something that affects me, and then I do something and that affects somebody else, when you have these loops of interaction, that's what creates emergence. So I'll start with an example. So where do tigers get their spots? Is it like we have, every tiger's spots are different? Like, are they totally determined by the genetics? Like, does their DNA tell them exactly where every single spot goes? It turns out the answer is no. Because, even like, genetically identical tigers will have different spots, similar but not the same. So let's try to make a model of it. Let's imagine we model an animal skin as a grid of cells. That can be black or white. And let's even just say that at first they're random. Which ones are black, which ones are white, is just random. And then let's further assume that the white cells can secrete like these chemicals. And there's two kinds of chemicals. There's activators and inhibitors. Activators tend to make other cells white. They want to make their neighbors white. While inhibitors make their neighbors black. Okay, so they're just, all the white cells are, spraying out this stuff at the others, and right, so they diffuse, and they could diffuse at different rates, let's say, and that actually is something that we can vary. It's how fast the activators diffuse compared to how fast the inhibitors diffuse. So this is, a simple example of a complex system, right? You've got lots of pieces, and they interact by sending these activators and inhibitors at each other. Can you guess what's going to happen? What's it going to look like at the end? Is it going to like stay random? Is it going to become all white or all black or like this? Okay, so let's actually try it. You could easily run a simulator for it. I'll actually show you one. But what happens is that it creates a pattern. And in fact, if you change the parameters, like if you change the like the number of white and black cells in the beginning, and if you change the relative diffusion rates, you're going to get different patterns. So here's a simulation. It's called NetLogo. And so I'm starting it. And as I change the ratio of activators to inhibitors, you can see that you get different emergent patterns. So that's where the tiger gets its spots and the leopard get its stripes, is that essentially their DNA specifies that you've got activators and inhibitors, and it specifies how fast they are. And then there's an emergent process of these chemicals moving around the skin that result in the patterns that you see. So a nice simple example of emergence. Okay, here's another example for you. So we've got you know what a metronome, like for keeping time with music. So let's say we put 32 of them on a platform and we just start them randomly, right? So they're all going like they start at different times. They're sitting on a platform. What will happen? Will they stay random? Will something I don't know, emerge? And if so, what? Actually, what will happen is that they will all synchronize. I do have a video of what it looks like. So it's a 4-minute video. So I'm just going to like skip ahead. So here we have these 32 metronomes on the platform, and the guy's starting them at random. Okay, so they're still at random. They're like 30 seconds in. So now I'm going to go like 1 minute in. Huh. Looks a little less random. See, what's the mouse? Okay, here's like, oh wow, they're pretty much close to synchronized. There's still like this guy on the right that's like doing the opposite or than everybody else. So let's go like to 3 minutes. They're all going at exactly the same pattern. So this is something that's called self-synchronization. And it's actually a very common phenomena, for example, in the natural world. Like, for example, have you ever been in a place where people are plotting and at first it's all random and then people start doing it more in self-synchronized way? Schools of fish, when they first are swimming around randomly and then they synchronize. Women's menstrual cycles, heart cells in the heart. Like there's pacemaker cells in the heart, which tells the heart when to beat. Now, they have to synchronize or else your heart would just be going, right? So there's self-synchronization. There's these insects, fireflies, fireflies that flash light. In a forest, there are places where you could see like a whole bunch of them and they all synchronize, so they're flashing at the same time. So there's some process where each individual, in some sense, prefers to be synchronized with its neighbors. And over time, that results in the whole group becoming fully synchronized. Okay, double pendulum. So imagine I have a friction-free pendulum, all right? It's like a perfect pendulum. It's just like a stick, right? And I just let go of it, and it's going to swing, right? So, okay, so now let's say we have two perfect pendulums. And if I let them go from exactly the same place at exactly the same time, then you figure they're going to swing in exactly the same way forever, right? Until they stop. Actually, it's friction free, so it's forever, right? So we can make it friction free in a simulation. So let's say we have two pendulums and we start them at slightly different positions, right? So one's like a millimeter away from the other. And then we let go at exactly the same time. So what's going to happen? Are they going to stay swinging pretty much the same, or are they going to become super different? But it turns out if it's a single pendulum, a tiny starting difference doesn't have that much impact. They stay together for quite a while, and maybe they'll start getting a little farther apart, but it's not dramatic, and it takes a long time. So it's a kind of a linear thing, which I don't know. To me, that makes sense. Now let's consider a double pendulum. Okay, so a double pendulum is like you have two sticks with a hinge in the middle. So let's say we've got two double pendulums, and we're starting them at very close to the same initial position. An atom's width apart, or a hair's width apart, and then we let them run. Would you expect it to be the same as the single pendulum? Like they'd be pretty close at first, and then over time they slowly get farther apart, or what? Okay, so we're going to actually try that. So right now, they're so close to one another that you only see one pendulum. Just a sec here. So at first, they were following the exact same track. But now look what happens. You see there's two different color pendulums? That's one was hidden behind the other, but now there's like a green and a red one. So you can see them both. So they're kind of close, still a little bit close. And now they're like basically, they're going in totally different directions. I think at this point we can say they're kind of like completely different. So what is the difference between a single pendulum and a double pendulum? So a single pendulum, I think you agree, is a simple system, right? There's like only one part to it, right? There's a stick. That's it. Right, but a double pendulum has two parts, and they're definitely interacting with each other. So even a double pendulum is already, a kind of, it's in the direction of being a complex system, multiple interacting parts. Now, it turns out that with a complex system with multiple interacting parts, if you change the starting conditions, even by a tiny amount, between two identical complex systems, they're going to diverge really, really fast. So, and this is, it's called sensitive dependence to initial conditions. And it creates an effect which is called deterministic chaos. Now, why do they call it that? Because it's deterministic, like this is a simulation, right? It's just running some math. There's no randomness in it whatsoever. And yet it's chaotic because, even tiny little changes in the initial conditions will produce unpredictably different. I mean, unless you actually run the simulation, it's not going to be easy to know where it goes, because it's not like a small change because a small result, a big change produces a big result. It's like even a tiny change produces a big change. That in order to illustrate this idea of sensitive dependence to initial conditions, a scientist who was a climatologist said that if a butterfly would flap its wings, for example, in Africa, that could produce through feedback loops, a set of changes that could result in something big, like, for example, a tornado in another continent. So, the idea is that if you have a system with feedback loops, small changes can get amplified as they go through more and more loops, and over space and over time, until at some point you can have a big effect somewhere else. So a question is, if little itty bitty tiny changes at the beginning can have big effects on what happens, then what does that imply about our ability to predict the future? So, like, imagine, like, let's say we had a perfect mathematical model of the future. We could predict exactly what happens if we know exactly what the current state is, right? But let's say we're off by just a little tiny bit in terms of what the current state is. Right. So it's unpredictable because we can never measure the world if only the tiniest of changes, inputs, can cause tremendous changes in output. And if we have limits in how well we can measure reality, which of course we always do, then it means that basically how are we going to predict? Like, maybe we thought something was 73.1 and it was 73.2. And because of that, the predicted result would be completely wrong because we made a tiny measurement error. Now, emergence can be a great thing, right? So, like, how many of you have heard, like, the invisible hand of the market? Is that if everybody acts in their self-interest with, with free and perfect competition, then society is going to be optimally prosperous. So it's essentially a collective intelligence statement, right? Is that if we let, each individual person do their best, negotiate with other people, even though there's nobody on top saying you do this, that the result is optimized. And in fact, that seems to be largely true because when you compare relatively free economies with planned economies, the free economies always do much better. However, sometimes not, as in the case of the pollution, right, that we talked about. Like, where did that come from? So I'm going to give you talk about emergent dysfunctions now, and I'll make a few statements about it, which I'll follow up on. First statement is that emergent dysfunctions underlie some of humanity's most serious challenges, including things like global environmental degradation. I'll explain that. They are probably getting worse, at least in many contexts. I'll say that too. We generally, and this is part of the problem, we generally have poor intuitions about when emergent dysfunctions are happening and how to fix them. And I think our brains are just, for some reason, not really designed to understand the emergent behavior of complex systems with lots of interacting parts. So, just out of the box, we're not necessarily going to get it. We have to use science to help us understand. But if we use science and math, we can begin to understand and manage them. So those are like my 4 key points. So they underlie some of humanity's most serious challenges. Climate change. We're putting all of this carbon in the atmosphere and making the climate change. And this is an example of something called the tragedy of a commons, an emergent dysfunction, which I'll describe. The arms race. It's a kind of positive feedback loop. Who needs enough, nuclear weapons to make the rebel dance, right? But somehow we got there. How did that happen? Financial collapses. Like, why does all of a sudden, the world loses trillions of dollars in the financial markets, just boom, one day to the next? Like, what happened? Nothing blew up, right? Nobody burned money. Okay, second point, they're probably getting worse. So remember that emergence and emergent dysfunctions are the result of many parts interacting over time, right? So question is, what happens as the world becomes more interdependent and the pace of our interactions increase? Globalization, right? I mean, we're being, now we can interact on a microsecond basis through, the internet, as opposed to, like, putting a letter on a sailing ship and then 4 months later, you get it, right? So, millions and millions and millions of times faster pace of interaction. And of course, a much broader scale of interaction. You could have a huge impact on somebody in like Antarctica just by sending them an email. So what happens, do you think if we have faster and stronger interdependencies, what effect do you think that'll have on emergence and emergent dysfunctions? So is there going to be more or less of it? More. So, in some cases, it'll be awesome. But in other cases, it can be really bad. So, like, for example, in a financial example, actually, that's not my favorite one. Yeah. My second one is the US had a huge financial collapse in 2008. Like from one day to the next, we were told that the economy had lost like $2 or $3 trillion of value. And we were also told that it began because of some instability in Thailand's financials market. Now, Thailand has an economy which is like, a tiny itty bitty piece compared to the United States. So like, how could that possibly have happened? To me, it was astonishing. Like I was like walking, thinking, well, we've lost $3,000. Like there should be like buildings burning and hundreds of millions of deaths to create that. But no, it was just basically feedback loops caused by a loss of confidence in a tiny financial market, which created other people to respond to, and that made other people respond to it. Loop, 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 and all of a sudden we're $3 trillion poorer. Crazy. We've had. I was in Boston, in the Northeast of the United States, and we had the electrical grid across a huge part of the United States. It just went down. Why? Because of a single transformer. I think like somebody shot at it with a gun, and they made it break. And then other transformers tried to take up the load, and they got overloaded, and so then they burnt out. And so there was like this spreading wave of burning out transformers going across the Northeast. Just like a domino effect, exactly. So, I don't love making this prediction, but my sense is that the more tightly interdependent we are, and more quickly we are, the more likely this is to happen. Unless we change things, unless we make things less interdependent, for example. Another point to make is that our brains seem to have poor intuitions about what kind of emergence we're going to get. And like, here's just like a silly example. They tend to occur when the individuals actually are trying to do the best for themselves. They're all just trying to do the best, but because of some nature of their interaction, it adds up to a bad effect. So like in this silly example, we have all these people who are in this really boring meeting. The meeting ended. They all tried to escape at the same moment, and they got stuck in the door, right? So, nobody, predicted that, wanted that. And so let me give you, a slightly more serious example. This is a study that was done at MIT in the School of Management, where I've been working for the last almost 30 years. And it's super simple example, right? There's a bathtub, and it's got a tap that's sending water into it. And then it has a drain where water's going out. And you could open and close those two taps, right? So you could either add more or less water, and you could slow up or speed up how fast it drains. Okay, super simple. And so what this professor did, John Sterman, did is that he gave students from the Sloan School of Management, who are smart guys, smart men and women, a chart showing what happens to those valves, right? So like in this case, the inflow would be on, then it'd get really low, and then it would go back to regular, and then it would get low, right? So that's the inflow. And the outflow just stayed steady. Okay, so this is a super simple example. They're just changing one of the vowels. So we did a bunch of things like that. And the idea was, that the students would have to draw a line representing the level of water in the tub, right? So that's all they have to do is just like on paper, draw a line based on this really simple example. And his conclusion, I won't go through all the examples, is that subjects from an elite business school have a poor level of understanding of this very simple kind of complex system. So, you know, um, I could give you a whole bunch of other examples, but this one I just thought was sort of interesting just because it seems so simple. We could even try someday, or I could send it to you and you can see how you do. And I mean, that's a super simple system. I mean, like if we look at even a simple inventory control model, it's got a lot of stocks and flows and valves and delays and stuff. Imagine how good we are at predicting what's going to happen here. We're not very good. And now I'm going to go into detail about some specific types that you might encounter and what you could do about them. Here's an example, which has to do with feedback delays. So the simple example is, let's say you have two cafes and coffee places, and people are trying to decide which one to go to. And in general, people want to go to the less busy cafe. Let's say they get faster service or whatever. And so if people had fully up-to-date information about which cafe is least busy, they just go there and everything would be fine. Like let's say you were just looking at them, when you had totally up-to-date information. You just walk into the less busy one, perfect. And you'll get an equilibrium. Both cafes will be about equally busy, right? Because each person is making their own choice and they have current information. Now, question is though, let's say that you have somewhat delayed information about which cafe is less busy. I don't know, like you're getting it through word of mouth or something, or you're checking a web page, which is always like, giving you information which is 10 minutes behind or whatever, right? So you have a delay about the information about which one is least busy. What's going to happen then to how busy the cafes are? It creates oscillations. So like at first people think cafe A is less busy, right? And so everybody goes there and they keep going there even after cafe A has become like really quite busy. And then eventually they catch on and, like 10 minutes later, whatever, people start saying, oh, this one's super busy. Now we should all start going over here. They'll keep going here until it gets too busy. So they're always going to be behind, and you're going to have the population of the cafes going up and down, up and down. So let's see. Yeah, so I actually ran a simulation of this. I did a paper, in fact, on this some years ago. So here you see two lines. Those represent how busy the two cafes are. And right, and so then over time, I increased the delay of the information, the amount of information delay. So when there's like very little or no information delay, both cafes they move around a bit, right? Because it's a bit random appearance of new customers, but basically they're in equilibrium, they're the same, everything's perfect. You add a little bit more delay, and then you start having bigger variations. One cafe will be quite busy, the other one not so busy. If you add a big enough delay, you'll actually find that one of the cafes is going to be totally empty some of the time. The other cafe is going to be ridiculously crowded. So just by adding information delay. So, this is, it's like one of those things where everybody's trying to do the best for themselves, right? Find a good cafe, but because the aggregate effect, everyone loses. You're either in an empty place, or you're in, the cafes lose because it's hard to predict how many staff they need, and so on. And so this is like a toy example, but it turns out that this has big effects in the real world. And I'll just give you one example of that, which is the P&G diaper bullwhip. So P&G is a company that makes consumer products, including diapers. And they observed that the inventory fluctuations in the amount of diapers they had in inventory, it would increase as you went down the supply chain. Even though the demand for diapers was pretty steady, right? You know, the number of babies isn't changing that fast, but you know, if the retailers will observe like a relatively small change in how many diapers they need, and though their inventory wouldn't change that much, the wholesalers who sell to the retailers, they're going to have bigger inventory fluctuations. They have to have bigger, you know, storage facilities, right? Because sometimes demand will shoot up and sometimes it'll drop down. It's like, why? You know, it's kind of weird because the amount of babies isn't changing that fast. Then the manufacturer would have even bigger oscillations. So the manufacturer would have times when the factory didn't have any work to do, and other times when they were like, you know, crazy trying to catch up. And then the suppliers for the factories had even bigger, you know, so just like a pain for everybody, right? If you have your demand and your therefore your inventory changing like that, and you know the feeling, especially for the people far at the end of the supply chain, was kind of like they were being whipped, like right, you know, they're being swung back and forth by the changes in demand. So it was called the bullwhip. And why did this happen? Basically, short story is that there was a delay in information from each stage to the next stage. When you have delays, you get oscillations. People are trying to correct, but they're always a little bit behind. Right. Well, there's two elements here, right? I mean, one is, you know, probably the change in diaper demand or something is somewhat predictable because there's more babies born in the spring, you know, or something like that. But this oscillation is not caused by anything external. It's a purely internal dynamic. So, you know, you could predict births for all you want. It's not going to predict this because the cause is inherent to the system of delays. So it's a different thing. And so how can you fix it? And I mean, one obvious suggestion is to remove the information delays from the system. So if you have very tight communication between the various layers, so nobody's like trying to guess, it could really reduce the oscillations. Now, of course, delays are a feature of the living world, of the physical world. And so, and in some cases, even a small delay is enough to cause the bullwhip. So it doesn't always work, but if the if delays are less important, and if you can speed things up a lot, you can pretty much solve this problem. It just depends on the relative speed of the relative length of the important delays and the length of the information delay. There's other solutions which are less intuitive, but actually also work super well. So one is don't try to optimize so much. So like what's happening is that, you know, the different people in the supply chain are saying, oh, I'm seeing an increase in demand. I better ramp up my capacity. You know, I need to get more stuff right away because I don't want to, you know, have even the least, you know, trouble in terms of meeting my customer demand, right? So they're trying to be as optimal as possible. Now, trying to be optimal means that they're like coupling themselves tightly to the person before them in the supply chain. Tight coupling, tight interdependency makes the influences between each part stronger. So a small change for one is going to have, you know, an impact on you. If they didn't try to optimize so much, like with a cafe, if they said, oh, it's all right, I don't care if it's a little bit crowded or not so crowded, you know, maybe I'll even pick, you know, randomly, stuff like that. Paradoxically, everybody wins. So like with my experiment, when people started picking randomly which cafe they went to, instead of trying to pick the least crowded cafe, both cafes ended up having an equal number of customers and everybody was happy. So actually making random choices was better than trying to optimize. So to me, that seems a little counterintuitive, but it totally works. Another thing, which is sort of like a kind of a corollary, is that let's say the cafes would give misinformation that would actually stochastically lie about how busy they were. So they're in effect adding some noise into the system, some randomness into the system. You get the same effect, is that the size of the oscillation gets smaller and both cafes are happy and everybody's happy. So I'm giving you this example because I'd like you to see how the causes of emergence can be hard to understand. I mean, let's say like emergence can be hard to understand. Like why is it oscillating like this until you study it? Then I guess it's easy. And also the solutions can sometimes be super weird. And that's part of why they've been hard to deal with until we started studying them as a science. Shared resource degradation. So we've had, real problem, obviously, on our planet, where we have the degradation of shared resources like clean air and clean water. And of course, who individually wants that, right? So how's that happening? So when you have a public shared resources, nobody pays for it, right? Who pays for clean air? Who pays for clean, it's just out there and we're all using it as much as we want, basically. So let's take an example. We're talking about air pollution. Let's say I have to decide whether to buy a polluting car or a not polluting car, right? A gas car or an electric car. So if other people get electric cars, they'll clean up the air for me, right? So why should I buy the more expensive electric car? My one electric car is not going, my gas car by itself is not going to destroy the environment. As long as other people buy clean cars, it doesn't matter what I do. So I'm going to buy the cheap car, buy the gas car. Now, of course, if everybody thinks that, what's going to happen? What will people buy? The gas car, right? Because everybody's thinking, I'm going to save myself money, and hopefully other people, I'm going to look after number one. So this is called a social dilemma. It's a situation very common where the net result of individually rational actions produces a globally irrational bad result. And in this case, it basically occurs because the shared resource is free, nobody owns it, and nobody has sort of a direct investment in protecting it. They can't, they don't own it, they can't control it. All they can control is their tiny little decisions. Also known as the tragedy of the commons. That's another name for it. And so what other problems are like this? Fishing, protecting wilderness, hunting. So does this basically make sense? Like when you have a shared resource, you could have people who make selfish but logical decisions. Net result is everybody loses. So how can we fix this? Here's another one. The problem is that, for example, that fresh air is free. You don't have to pay to use fresh air. Let's say you have to pay to make air dirty, which is what a carbon tax is, right? If you, burn carbon, you have to pay, $1 for every pound or whatever of carbon that you burn. You have to pay for the pollution you create. So that all of a sudden makes people have an incentive not to, right? But they have been shown to work in certain circumstances if they're done right. Like for example, do you guys? It's not even that big a thing anymore, but the ozone hole, that thing, and the ozone hole is caused by humanity releasing chemicals that came like in our hairspray and stuff that lasted a long time, went up in the atmosphere, killed the ozone, and created a hole so that lots of ultraviolet light can come through and give us cancer, right? So that's much less of a problem than it used to be, basically because, and to tell you the truth, I'm not sure if they use carbon tracks or cap and trade, but they're both ways of essentially providing a monetary incentive to not pollute. So they can work, and then in some cases, people game it, and they find ways to like make lots of money from the carbon tax and carbon credits. So it's a matter of good design, but it can work. Okay. Solution worsens problem. So this one is kind of, I thought this was interesting because I'd always wondered about this. So like, there's some, highways in the Boston area, which I drive in, and if it's very empty, there's no problem. But if it's sort of like a medium level of traffic, I've noticed it's like, at first I'll be going quite fast, there's not much traffic, and then all of a sudden there's a lot of traffic and we're all moving super slow, or we even stop. And then after a few minutes, there's no traffic in front of me anymore, and everything speeds up and I'm going fast, and then it slows down and stops again and again and again. And it's like, what? And like, I didn't see anything happening in the real world. There were no accidents that people were staring at or whatever. So, why is that happening? So let me show you a simulation. Where's the simulation? I guess this is it. Okay, this simulation also from the NetLogo program. And so it has some cars that are just sort of going at a random speed and position. And you can see like the same things happening. So what's, and like these little graphs here can kind of tell you what's going on. So this is like the how fast the car is allowed to go. Like this is the speed limit. This is the average speed of all the cars. It's like half the speed limit. And if you look at an individual car, like there's the red car, which had a little circle about it. The red car is going fast, and then it comes to a stop. And it's going fast, and it comes to a stop, right? So it's like, it's weird. And so how can we understand this? So as it's actually pretty simple, is that people are trying to move as fast as they can, right? They want to get home for dinner. So they drive fast until they see other cars. When they see other cars, when it gets crowded, of course you slow down, right? Because you don't want to be driving close when you're close to another car. And so you slow down, and then you get a clump of cars. Now the cars in the front of the clump, they see free space, so they speed up again. And as they drive away, eventually all the cars in front of you disappear, right? And so then you can speed up, and you're driving as fast as you can, so you can catch up with the other people. So basically the problem is that when cars are bunched together, they go slowly. That's problem one. Problem two is that people who are trying to get home fast will create these high density clumps. You see what I'm saying? You drive until you hit a clump. You drive fast until you hit a clump. And then you slow down because you don't want to, die. And so the aggressive drivers create the clumps that slows everybody down. So in other words, the faster you try to drive, the slower you're going to get home. Because you create these clumps, and the clumps slow everybody down. You're going like half the speed. So what if everybody drove evenly spaced? Just kept it even spaced, didn't try to catch up to the other person. Everybody would get home twice as fast in this example. So frustrating. So, for this general kind of problem, what can you do? Again, it's that weird solution. Don't try to optimize so hard. Don't try to drive so fast. And like, I really, now of course people have to collaborate in this, right? If I'm the only chill person and everybody else is aggressive, I'm still in trouble. But if everybody could be chill, and you can also like use laws, like, you could give people a ticket if they're too close to other cars. Yeah. So the solution, trying to drive fast, made the problem worse. You got home late. Now there's lots of other examples of this. Like, did you guys hear about the toilet paper thing in the United States during COVID? It was really funny, right? Because people started buying lots of toilet paper because they thought we're going to need lots of toilet paper because of COVID. Now, I don't know why. because COVID doesn't make you go to the bathroom, especially, but everybody started buying toilet paper. And so then people saw that toilet paper is disappearing. And so they rushed to buy toilet paper. And so like I actually was ordering toilet paper off of this website for like $30 for like 8 rolls of toilet paper. And so people created the toilet paper shortage that they were afraid of. COVID didn't. It was just an emergent dysfunction. Nations buy military arms in order to be superior to their enemies. The enemies do the same thing. That's why we've got 30,000 nuclear weapons in the world. No other reason. Why do we have such big cars, especially in the States? At least partly, I think, because you feel safer if you've got the biggest car on the road. So it's a positive feedback loop. How can we fix it? Don't try to, don't drive so aggressively. You have treaties, so you set an upper limit on the amount of toilet paper you could buy or whatever, the amount of weapons you can get, and everybody wins, right? Nobody wins by spending billions of dollars on weapons that can't possibly benefit you. Okay, and I'm going to do one other example. It's actually similar dynamic, but in something that's closer to the, more directly similar to the topic of the class, and that's online toxicity. So I don't know, I mean, I guess people in Morocco and maybe Nigeria, I don't know, are very polite and don't engage in like mean interactions online, social media. But at least in the US, there's been a huge problem with toxicity. And a lot of news organizations have turned off comments on their articles because they were getting so many negative comments that people like, they felt dirty just going to these websites. So they removed them. So now why is that happening? So, one possibility, of course, is like it's anonymous, right? So you kind of, you can say what you want, and also it's harder to control who's there. It's harder to kick people out. So those are all true. But there's actually another reason, which I think is at least as powerful, and that's what I call attention wars. Okay, so imagine you're in an online forum, you're in Twitter or Reddit or something like that. It's a pretty popular forum. That means there's bunches of people all submitting comments, right? So there's a big pile of comments being added to all the time, and there you are. You have your comment to make, and you'd like to be heard, right? You want to have, maybe you've got a great idea, really sharp insight. You'd like to be heard. How can you be heard when there's a giant pile of other people? You get louder, right? I mean, how else do you do it? Now, how can you get louder in an online forum? You could repeat stuff a lot. You can say stuff in an extreme way that grabs attention. You could become toxic, say it in a mean way so that people respond to you. Now, if everybody is aware of that dynamic, what's going to happen to the discussion as a whole? More hostile, because people are competing for attention. You get attention by doing nasty stuff. And, if enough people are aware of that, you get this upward spiral of toxicity. So how do we fix this? We need to kind of remove the feedback loop in some way. And the feedback loop comes from the fact that being louder gets you more attention. So let's say, and this is just like one example, when people added comments to something, they can add comments, but they don't see what the other people said. All they said is an AI summary of what the other people said, right? So if somebody says something 1 time or 100 times, it appears just once in the AI summary. If they say it in a toxic way, the AI summary doesn't. If they say it in an extremized way, okay, but it's only going to appear once, and there's going to be non-extremized voices appearing just as often. So the feedback loop, where you get more attention, more extremization, goes away.